We can't study all of global history in one small course, but we can examine some big events, the roots of our current problems. Module 2 of Global History looks at the Industrial Revolution and the roots and fruits of World War. There are 4 short videos. The first looks at background to the Industrial Revolution. The second looks at Europe before the Industrial Revolution, giving some background to the World Wars. The third looks at World War I. And the fourth introduces something called just war theory. Let's get started. Industrialization is a process. It's a process in which society is transformed from an agricultural base into one based on the manufacture of goods and services. Before industrialization, societies are agricultural. Most people, the great majority of people, live and work on farms. Very few people actually own land. Just a few rich families own land. Most people work the land as employees, laborers, serfs. Some people support the communities, the agricultural communities, and some people work as servants in houses, but most people are tied to the land, the rhythms of the land, as agricultural laborers. Through industrialization, labor becomes mechanized. There's mass production of stuff. Skilled trades are replaced by assembly lines. We're going to look at the example of England. Industrialization transformed England, then the changes spread throughout the world. Other areas of Europe and the world went through industrialization, but England is relevant for Canada because we imported their industrial revolution, and they kind of led the way in that process. The transformation was so quick and thorough in England, it became known as an industrial revolution. In the space of 60 years, England was transformed from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Now, 60 years seems like a long time to us, but in the terms of social change, that was a short period, particularly back then. So, where and when exactly did this happen? England in the 18th and 19th centuries. Usually around 1750 is given as the date of the start of the Industrial Revolution. It's sort of an average date. So through the 1700s and 1800s, the Industrial Revolution took root in England and was exported. It continued past then, of course. It spread to Europe and North America, and it's still circling the globe. So what happened? Traditional society, where wealth and power were based on inherited land and family connections, that changed. There was large-scale introduction of machines for manufacturing, transportation, and farming. And that changed society. Traditional society changed. Financial dealing and ownership, the ownership of factories, railroads, banks, became the basis of wealth and power rather than land ownership. And to fuel the Industrial Revolution, there was large-scale resource exploitation. We started to use Earth's resources faster than the Earth could replace them. We started to pollute a lot faster than the Earth could absorb it. Some things didn't change, however. The merchant owner class preserved European dominance or hegemony. Hegemony is kind of a big word you see a lot in history books, but it means dominance. So the class of owners that were dominant before the Industrial Revolution, it changed a little bit, but they looked very much like the class of the merchant owner class after and during the Industrial Revolution. Another thing that expanded European hegemony or dominance, colonialism expanded to feed the Industrial Revolution. So why is the Industrial Revolution important? The need for raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution led to conflict over resources and trade routes. The innovations of the Industrial Revolution led to an arms race for weapons more deadly than any known previously. And we began to consume the Earth's resources faster than the Earth could produce them. We pollute it more than the Earth could absorb. So the Industrial Revolution is a major turning point in human and Earth history. We still feel its fire. Just think of the history of industrial Cape Breton. Think of how we went from a colonial society that displaced the indigenous people who lived here, to an industrial society with the coming of steel and coal, to post-industrial society. If you don't know the history of Cape Breton, you'll get a chance to explore that a little bit later in a module. So how did this Industrial Revolution happen? There was a period called the Enlightenment, which changed thinking. Before the Enlightenment, in Europe and other parts of the world, the church, whether it was the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church, and in other parts of the world, other religions, they really dominated daily life by dictating how people could think. It wasn't greatly questioned. So that if you were a young man or woman and you thought you had a better way of doing something, whether it was a herb for healing or a piece of applying some knowledge to make some technology to grind grain faster, you were probably told, oh, that's the work of the devil. This is the way God made society. This is the way society has to be. That's what people thought before the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment started to question whether things are like they are because God willed it that way. During the Enlightenment, the scientific method, which you learn about in biology or chemistry class, scientific method started to be applied to everyday life without a church authority saying, oh, that's the work of the devil. This led to inventions, to changes in agriculture, mining, transportation, and manufacturing. So who did this affect? Everyone. It led to economic, social, cultural, and political change. Daily life and the planet were affected, then and now. It led to a process of urbanization. So people left the countryside and farms to work in the new, smoky towns and factories. Very unsafe factories. Towns and cities mushroomed, multiplied, and darkened, bringing on even greater pollution, slum housing, and social problems. There are connections to the slave trade and colonization. In England and other industrial nations had to exploit the rest of the world even more than they had previously to fuel the Industrial Revolution. For example, where did the English mills get raw cotton to make into clothing on an industrial scale? Well, they got that from the States. But where did the American plantations get people to grow cotton most cheaply in terrible working conditions? Well, they imported slaves. So there came a whole trade triangle around supplying the needs of the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, factory and mine workers organized unions, and this led to a long struggle for decent living and working conditions for workers, at least some workers. Again, that's part of our history in Cape Breton that you could look at in a later module. Here's a word cloud of words that connect with the Industrial Revolution, mass production, faster transportation, consumption. It all started at the Industrial Revolution. We're going to have a brief quiz show to review some of the main ideas from this section. So, at what country do we look at the Industrial Revolution? In this presentation, anyway. England. So in this case, we're focusing on one European country, England. In what centuries did the Industrial Revolution primarily occur in England? Okay, so remember how the centuries run. If we use 1750 as the rough date for the start of the Industrial Revolution, that means we're looking at the 18th and 19th centuries. To what process does the description below refer? Society is transformed from agricultural into one based on the manufacture of goods and services. Labor is mechanized with mass production. Skilled trades are replaced by assembly lines. To what process does that refer? Did you say industrialization? To what process does this description below refer? People left the countryside and farms to work in towns and factories. Urbanization. Okay, urban meaning city. The slave trade is related to the Industrial Revolution. True or false? That's very true. You may not have made that connection before, but the Industrial Revolution fired up the slave trade. What areas of life changed during the Industrial Revolution? Economic, social, political, cultural. If you said all areas, you would have been correct. What's a synonym, a word that means the same, for hegemony? And that's just a fancy word for dominance that you see in history books. Dominance. That moved a little fast, sorry. Which of these happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution? Large-scale introduction of machines for manufacturing, transportation, and farming. Financial dealing and ownership, like factories, railroads, and banks, became the basis for wealth and power. Large-scale resource exploitation. Expanded colonialism, extending European hegemony. Or all of the above. What do you think? And it's all of the above. So that's the background to the Industrial Revolution. The next video gives some background on war and peace in the 19th and 21st centuries, very much related to the Industrial Revolution, which kicked it off.